Created us so wonderfully and given us such tremendous dignity. We pray that through our continued consideration of your church's social teaching today, that you would help us to recognize more deeply our own dignity and inspire within us a desire to protect the dignity of others. We ask this in Jesus' name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay. So, I'm Father Tyler Dennis, as you heard me mention earlier this morning. I'm the associate pastor at St. Joseph Parish in Spearfish, St. Paul in Belfouche, and Our Lady Star of the Sea in Newell. And I've been ordained 5 years now. It's really my pleasure to be here with you and talk to you a little bit about a Catholic approach to these legislative issues. And speaking with me today is Sue Jimmerman, who for many years now in our diocese has been on the forefront of keeping track of what's happening legislatively. She did this first in the Diocesan Pro-Life Commission, and as that commission transitioned into the Social Justice Commission, she continued to do that for the diocese with regard not just to pro-life legislation, but really to all legislation that touches on these topics of Catholic social teaching. And so I'm going to try to take as little time with my portion here as I can and give her lots of time to speak, because you're really not likely to meet a better informed Catholic when it comes to these legislative issues. So I might say, Sue, really it is a pleasure to be able to be here with you. So the issues that the bishop addressed this morning as we began really are foundational to us as Catholics and our approach to addressing areas of social concern from the legislative perspective. And as Catholics, fundamentally, we acknowledge the dignity of every human life. That human beings are made in God's image and likeness. And not only that, but that as human beings, we have this same flesh that Jesus Christ assumed when God became man. And even further, that Jesus Christ should die to save human beings. And it's significant that Jesus didn't become a duck or something like that. He became a human being. And likewise, it's significant that he died to save human beings. Right? This means that our dignity really is elevated above all the rest of creation. And flowing from that dignity is the fact that human life then is sacred in all of its instantiations. Every human life is sacred. And in fact, so sacred that when it comes to evaluating institutions, politicians, legislation, we're always going to do that looking first and foremost on the capacity of that institution, of that politician, of that legislation to promote, to protect, and to defend human dignity and the sanctity of their lives, or if in fact what they represent and what they promote is degrading to human dignity. That really does become foundational to our approach to the whole political sphere, to the public square and to public policy. To what extent does this promote, protect, and defend human dignity? Now, that question of human dignity is going to be present in every facet of the church's social teaching. And poverty has to do with human dignity. War has to do with human dignity. Labor law has to do with human dignity. All of these things are intimately connected to that whole question of human dignity. But foundational to human dignity is a right to live in the first place. All other rights are contingent upon this right to life. And so one of the very first things the U.S. bishops tell us when it comes to our political lives is to recognize that without the right to life, no other right is really a right. Without the right to life, no other right really has a great deal of significance, because it's all precipitated on the idea that we're living in the first place, that we have a right to live. And so the church teaches us that we really do have an obligation to defend the sanctity of human life. And as the bishop pointed out, there are these non-negotiable issues: abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and the question of traditional marriage. These are non-negotiable because they really get right to the heart of this whole question of human life and the purposes of human life. Now, as I say those, the accusation that many people will level against Catholics is that makes us single-issue voters. No, absolutely not. As Catholics, in good conscience, we are not single-issue voters. We really must consider how are we going to address things like poverty, homelessness, joblessness, education. Those are really important issues to us, and we have to consider all of them when we're selecting a candidate or when we're supporting a piece of legislation. But some of these issues are so significant that support, for instance, for abortion rights, support for legalized euthanasia or for legalized embryonic stem cell research is sufficient to exclude a candidate from our consideration. That these are so important, that these are so essential to our understanding of the Church's social tradition, that they really can preclude a candidate from our consideration. Now, and that's an idea that's filled out more completely in the U.S. Bishop's document about faithful citizenship. Thank you. So, the U.S. Bishops wrote this a number of years ago, forming consciences for faithful citizenship. They updated every few years, right around election time. It seems like they take an opportunity to address this document again. If there are any new legislative issues or new issues that have come up in socially and culturally that need to be addressed, they include those. So most of these things are included in this document, and it's well worth a read. You can find the whole thing at the U.S. Bishop's website and download it there for free, or you can spend the money to buy a printed copy of it. And you can also find a really nice summary of that document there. Now, one of the things that happens is that we find ourselves in a world, especially in the two-party system that we experience in this country, where there's almost never a candidate, and certainly never a particular party's platform that represents everything that the church stands for. And so we're forced into the situation of having to sort of make these judgments about who then are we going to support. And that gets very complicated. And in that regard, the bishop tells us, or the bishops tell us, that there are really two things that we have to lean upon. The first is a well-formed conscience. We really need to have a clear sense of what the church teaches with regard to the principles of the Catholic social tradition. We really need to understand clearly what are the aims and the goals of the church's social tradition. However, even understanding the aims, the goals, and the principles of the church's social tradition, we find that men and women of goodwill can disagree over how they're best implemented. For instance, I think that every one of us in this room would readily agree that poverty is an evil that should be addressed. That it would be better if there weren't poor people. If I were to ask you to tell me how you think we should do that, there would probably be a fist fight before we're done. People brawl over these sorts of things. And so the second principle to which we turn in making these decisions is, the bishops tell us we need to foster within ourselves the virtue of prudence. And prudence is that virtue whereby we properly judge what ought to be done in a given situation with a given set of circumstances. What ought to be done? Well, that's kind of a nebulous thing, isn't it? In that regard, we probably all think we're the most prudent of people. So how do we grow in prudence? Well, prudence, as it turns out, is in the tradition of the church, in the history of the church, considered one of the cardinal virtues, or one of the virtues upon which all other virtues rest. And the other three of the cardinal virtues are courage, justice, and temperance. And these four virtues are so intimately connected that as we grow in courage, as we grow in temperance, as we grow in justice, likewise we're going to grow in prudence. And we're going to be able to trust more and more the judgments that we make, that our judgments are in fact prudential, if we're growing in these other three virtues as well. So it's one of the readiest ways to consider whether or not we really are making prudential decisions. So, in the end, however, if we are educating ourselves well, if we're forming our consciences well, and if we're prayerfully making this determination of how we're going to vote or what legislation we're going to support, and we're doing so in a way that is consonant with the Church's social tradition, with what the Church's social teaching gives us, then we can rest assured that at the very least we're not sinning. We're not displeasing God. That we're not doing something that's going to cause us eternal ramifications. If we're doing it in a way with a well-formed conscience, prayerfully and according to the teachings of the Church. And that's the most important thing, is that we form ourselves well before we go into the ballot box, because these decisions are never easy. And as we all know, and as I've already commented, there's never somebody who represents us perfectly. We do the best we can using these principles, and I do commend to your reading before Election Day this documents. It will help you to make good decisions before you get there. Sue is now going to talk to us a little bit about the legislative process and some of the issues that are facing us as a nation and as a state in the coming legislative cycle.
It's great to have you here. Some of you may have been more involved with the legislature than others, but I just want to start with just a basic understanding of what the legislative process is. Our session in South Dakota meets for 40 days every year, and they start the second Tuesday of January, so they'll be starting on January 13th this next year. They do leave 1 or 2 days at the end of session so that they can address any governor vetoes or any emergency measures that come up. We have 35 legislative districts, 1 senator and 2 representatives from each. So we have 35 senators and 70 representatives. They do follow a legislative calendar that tells them the deadlines for when they have to file a bill, when they have to move a bill to another house, things like that that are important. And this keeps the session moving because they usually deal with up to 500 bills, some years even more. Last year there was 449 bills, and that was the lowest number of bills since 1964. So you never know from year to year. Of those, 249 passed and were sent to the governor. The governor did veto 1, which was a low number, and that was not overridden by the legislature, so 248 became law, and that's about 55%. So you can see that they have a lot to deal with in 40 days. The process that they go through with the bills can change a lot from when they're introduced. They can advance quickly, or they can kind of stall out. It just depends on what else is on the agenda for that committee. They can be amended. They can be deferred to another legislative day. They can even be deferred to the 41st day, which in a 40-day session means they're not going to deal with that again. Or they can just vote against it. And, so if you're following a particular issue, a particular bill, you kind of have to monitor it as it's going through the process so that you see the amendments that are being put on it, you see how it's being voted on and when it moves to to the floor of the Senate, to the floor of the House, and then to the other house. So it can be involved, but you know, if you're just following a couple bills, it's not too hard to do. And the legislative website makes it easy to do that. So I'll talk to you more about that later. I've given you two handouts, one on how an idea becomes a law, and the other one on the legislative process, so that'll just give you a little more in-depth information on some of those things. There are several maneuvers that legislators can use that you might be interested in. One is called whorehouse, and this is unique to South Dakota. No other state has this. That means by amendment, the contents of a bill that's already been introduced and has a title, the contents of it can be changed. They can just make it into some other bill. And it doesn't happen real often, but it does happen occasionally. So your bill may start out as something you support, and down the road it may be something you don't want anything to do with, because it could even have changed the stance on that bill from for it to against it. Another maneuver is called the smoke out, and this is when a bill has been defeated in committee, but it can be then brought to the floor of the House or the Senate if enough of the legislators want to do that. And you have to vote to bring it out and request that the committee deliver it to the floor so they can discuss it and vote on it. And I've given you another handout. It's called Legislative Fun Facts and Trivia. And that's just some interesting things about the South Dakota legislature. So you can read that at your own leisure and maybe learn a little bit more that you didn't know about the history of legislation in South Dakota. You know, legislation is how we try to better meet the needs of our citizens and how we try to protect human dignity. So even though it sounds maybe like a boring topic, it's a very vital topic. And it's something that we should be conscious of what's happening in our state and in our nation. October is Respect Life Month, so what better time to talk about some of the issues that affect human dignity when we come to legislation. I'll mainly discuss South Dakota legislation, but some of it will build on things that are happening throughout the nation. So I'll bring in some of that too, but I have given you a handout on national legislation because there is a lot going on, and you know, with the time that we have today, we really can't get into as much of that as we would like to. I will cover a lot of issues, but I can't cover the whole range of issues, and I can't provide a lot of details. So if you have questions afterwards, see me about that. But I hope the information that I share with you today will help you to be a little bit better informed and will encourage you to get involved in some aspect. Abortion has been called the preeminent threat by the bishops, and this is the threat to the most vulnerable member of our society. And over the years, South Dakota has done a lot to limit abortion. We've got informed consent, we've got parental consent laws, we've got clinic regulations and reporting. We've got the longest waiting period in the nation before a woman can have an abortion. And last year they passed a bill banning sex selection abortions. So you can't abort because it's a girl and you wanted a boy. We have new challenges though every year, but especially now under the Affordable Care Act. You all know about the coverage, you know, for contraceptives and things like that. But we just found out from a report from the Government Accounting Office that nationally there are over 1,000 of the qualified health plans that allow abortions without having the people pay a separate fee for it. South Dakota luckily has some restrictions on our qualified health plans, so hopefully we won't be quite as impacted by that as some states have been. A possible piece of legislation in regard to abortion this year could be the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. And this protects unborn children after 20 weeks of development. It's not perfect. We'd like to stop it altogether, but we do what we can. Substantial medical evidence is showing that the nerve receptors are developed in the unborn baby by 20 weeks, maybe even a little earlier. But this enables them to feel significant pain, even if it's a helpful surgical procedure. But certainly in abortion, it can be significant pain. 10 states currently have this law, including Nebraska and North Dakota. And the national ban has passed the U.S. House of Representatives, but it has not been taken up by the Senate. Another issue that's been much in the news in the last few years in South Dakota is the death penalty. Throughout South Dakota history, there have been 18 executions. Various attempts have been made over the years to repeal the death penalty, but they have all been unsuccessful. 3 executions have occurred here in the last 7 years. 3 men are currently on death row, and one of them is very likely to be executed in May of this coming year. In 2014, the legislature did try to pass a bill that would repeal the death penalty only for crimes that were committed after July 1st of 2014. It's been a hard road to try and get across to the people that we can get along without a death penalty. But even this bill, which set a date after this, will do it. And instead will impose life imprisonment. That was unsuccessful. But I think the legislators that sponsored that learned a lot from the debate and the discussion and the voting, and I think they will probably rework that bill in some way and bring it back again this year, and especially being we continue to have executions. How many of you know of someone who, or a family that's been affected by sex abuse or by domestic violence? The numbers are huge. In the 2014 state legislature, they did authorize what they call the Jolene's Law Task Force, and this is to study child sexual abuse. The task force was named for a woman who lived through and has publicly spoken about the sexual abuse that she went through when she was growing up in Nebraska. And she is a member of that task force. So she's going to bring that perspective from a victim to help them to study this and to bring some recommendations on law and policy that maybe can be implemented through the state law. So I think we'll see some legislation maybe geared toward better prevention, better public awareness, maybe even some enforcement improvements in that issue. And domestic violence, of course, we all know that that's going on too. And in fact, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. In 2013, the legislature authorized a domestic study committee. And last year, they did bring forth some bills that basically made some changes in existing statute language. So I think going forward, they will probably bring bills that get deeper into the issue. And I think we can expect some bills on better programs for victims, better assistance, maybe some better enforcement or prevention. So watch for those kind of things too. Marriage and related issues we could probably talk all day about. There's been so much going on. I even checked the paper before I came today to see if the judge had made a decision in South Dakota. In November of 2006, we did pass a state constitutional amendment, and this allowed marriage only between a man and women. And it said that these are the only relationships that will be recognized in South Dakota. But as you know from news in the papers, this has been challenged by 6 couples in South Dakota. A federal district court hearing was held last week in Sioux Falls. The judge has not yet released her ruling on that. Our state ban was defended by our state attorney general, and I make a point of that because in a lot of other states, the attorney generals are not defending their state bans. So we're lucky in some sense. Once the judge rules, it's certain that the case will be appealed to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. And just to a little bit of a hopeful note in that is that this federal court did uphold Nebraska's same-sex marriage ban in 2006. And they did say that it did not violate the Constitution of the United States. So, maybe we will get a ruling that we can appreciate, and maybe we won't. It's hard to know. But this has been happening all across the country. State bans are being struck down by the courts. I have given you in the national legislation handout some information about some congressional bills that have been put forward. Whether or not they will advance, I don't know, but it is an effort on the part of our national legislators to try and respond to some of the things that are going on with regard to marriage. And I would also encourage you to read Bishop Bruce's column and Father Tad's column in this month's West River Catholic on marriage. Some good insight there. As bad as this is, with the marriage decisions and trying to redefine marriage, the homosexual agenda includes no discrimination and no exemptions. And I emphasize that because these are real religious liberty threats to especially religious-based businesses or ministries. Have you heard of the many cases around the U.S. where business people have been, they're trying to live out their religious convictions through their business, but they're coming under, first of all, personal attacks, but they're also coming under legal attacks because of their views on traditional marriage. And some of them are receiving charges from human relations committees in their area. They're being fined. They're being sentenced to re-education. And they're even ending up closing their businesses, losing their livelihood. So it's a threat. There's a case of 2 ordained ministers in Idaho who own and run a private wedding chapel, which is a religious corporation. So after the federal courts struck down the Idaho marriage ban, the city officials came to them and said, as ordained ministers, they are required to perform same-sex marriages. Or they face a fine of 180 days in jail and over $1,000 for every day that they refuse to perform them. So there's a real religious harassment that's going on and religious needs. Not too long ago, Houston passed a bill called the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance to protect gay and lesbian people from discrimination, but they didn't include a religious exemption. And the citizens and the churches became so upset about this that they circulated petitions. They got over 50,000 signatures. They took them to the city, and the city refused to take them. And the mayor's response was to issue a subpoena for all of the pastor's speeches, private emails, texts, and other communications related to her office, the bill, and the efforts to repeal the bill. So, of course, the pastors have now filed a legal challenge against this. Even the Texas Attorney General is coming out and saying the subpoena should be dropped, and warning the mayor that she's infringing on the First Amendment rights here. So, you know, things are happening that don't make sense. In July, our president issued an executive order prohibiting federal government contractors from sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, and forbidding gender identity discrimination in the employment of federal employees with no religious exemption. Two of our USCCB chairmen have said, this is unprecedented. It's extreme. It needs to be opposed, if nothing else, because of the lack of religious exemption. Even with the Federal Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which has been in Congress for a number of years and hasn't passed, but it would outlaw workplace discrimination on these two bases in addition to the regular things that discrimination applies to. The ACLU, the gay and rights lesbian groups, the activist groups were all on board with this until the Senate passed it in 2013 and added the religious exemption. And now they've all pulled their support for this bill, and they're looking at other ways that they can go around this and do what they want. In South Dakota, there's nothing in our laws that explicitly address discrimination on these two bases. Currently, 18 states and the District of Columbia do include both of those, and 3 states include just sexual orientation. There have been various attempts over the years to revise South Dakota law and to include these, and there's been other attempts to protect businesses and other people. In 2010, the ACLU of South Dakota, along with Equality South Dakota, sought to amend the State Human Relations Act and include those 2 categories. That failed. And in 2012, they tried again, and that failed. It's certain with what's happening nationally that they'll come back again and they'll keep pushing for the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity in the discrimination laws. In 2014, this year, there were several bills that were introduced to try and protect businesses from civil liability for their refusal to serve or to hire a person based on their sexual orientation. And there was another bill to protect clergy, lay officials, religious organizations, citizens, or businesses from this liability. All of these faced heavy flack. It was deferred to the 41st day in the first committee they went to. The legislators themselves faced multiple attacks. And I would say that probably one of those legislators is facing a very difficult re-election campaigns year because of that. So there's a lot of aggressiveness, I guess I'd say, going on from some of these advocacy groups. And we need to be watchful in the bills that we are including religious exemptions and protecting our business people who are trying to live out their religious convictions through their business.
I have a question or a comment on that. Why would someone openly discriminate and consider that okay on a religious basis?
I think I'll defer that question, if you don't mind, until Father talks, because he will specifically talk about some of the points.
Could you answer it now?
Sure. What we're talking about is not about discrimination in the sense of being able to demean them or degrade them. We're not talking Jim Crow kinds of things. Right. And so what we're talking about, for instance, these anti-discrimination laws would say that, for instance, Catholic Social Services does adoption services. Right now, because they're a religious institution, they are not required to place adoptive children into the homes of same-sex couples. Anti-discrimination laws would forbid them from making any kind of distinction between a couple of opposite genders or a couple of the same gender. So as Catholics who are deeply convinced that children have a right to grow up with both the mother and the father, and that this is as God intended, they would be forced in the position of either saying that we cannot do adoption services anymore, or we will violate our conscience in order to continue doing so. So we're not talking about things like, they can't drink from our water fountains.
What about hiring? I mean, that's what you brought up. That's what, I think you're going to the extreme to make a point. But what if someone who is homosexual has applied for a job and they're discriminated against, saying we don't hire you kind?
Well, again, there's going to be a time and a place where that's important for us to be able to do that, though. As a pastor, for instance, and I send out my announcement that I'm looking for a new director of youth ministry. And the applicant that I get is a gay man who's living an actively gay lifestyle, has in fact entered into a gay marriage. I am not, by virtue of these laws, allowed to say that that is a disqualifying factor.
And that's going to the extreme.
No, that's not
I come to
extreme,
you-
unfortunately.
Well, yes, because it only concerns you. What about Lloyd Frine that is saying, I need a hired man. The hired man comes and applies. He wants to hire him. The guy says, by the way, I'm gay, I'm monogamous, and whatever. He said, I won't hire you because you're gay. Don't go to the church again.
That's a different kind of issue.
No, it's the same
It's
issue.
the same issue.
It's a
It's
different
a job.
circumstance.
It's an employment opportunity.
What I
And
mean-
the church can't be on one side and everyone else on under different rules.
Well, they can't. The truth is the truth. 2 plus 2 is always 4, no matter what.
I was listening to a talk show, and I was surprised to find out, and I want to know if he's right, that only 1.5% of the population is homosexual. I mean, that's a small percentage.
The percent is low. It's not quite that low from what I've heard. I've heard like 3%. But it's still extremely low.
But they're changing what we can do, what we can say, how we can
What we can
live.
think.
Yeah, what we can think.
I don't agree with that, but
You don't agree they're changing that stuff?
Well, that
I don't
mayor
agree.
in Texas is doing that.
they aren't changing the way we think. We think the way
They're trying
we
to.
think.
They not only want to be gay and have their rights, they want us to say it's all right.
Let me, Dan, I want to intervene here before this gets ugly. Oh, yes, it will, I assure you. Let's remember that when we're talking about this issue, we really have to make a distinction, as the bishop was talking to this morning. As Catholics, first and foremost, we always look at every institution and every piece of legislation with regard to its ability to protect, defend, and promote the dignity of the person, or the way that it detracts from the dignity of the person. Okay? So that means that these are persons who, while experiencing attraction to members of the same gender, nevertheless have the same dignity that we do. And everything that we do and laws that we create need to respect that dignity. They always have to respect that dignity. Now, one of the things as Catholics that we acknowledge is that because of their dignity, there are certain things that are, there are certain behaviors that are beneath our dignity that are contrary, in fact, to our dignity. But we can't create laws that discriminate simply for the sake of discrimination. We can't create laws that say to them, there are things that you can't do that everybody else can do just because you're gay. Okay? However, we have to balance that on the other hand with the rights of other individual citizens as well. And that's an issue right now where we don't necessarily have absolutely clear direction from the church. And so what I'm thinking about, for instance, my sister-in-law happens to be a baker. And she gets a lot of wedding cake business. And the time is coming sooner rather than later when somebody's going to approach her and they're going to ask her to make a cake for the wedding of two people of the same gender. Now, I'm not sure how she'll choose to respond to that question. And I'm not altogether sure how I think she ought to respond to that question. Part of me says that in conscience, she should be free not to have to participate. Another part of me says that there were people who, in conscience, said they couldn't sit in the same restaurant with black people. I know these two things are not the same. I know they're not the same. But there's a real balance that has to be walked here. And I think that, I don't think we can simply dismiss the religious objections of people of faith. And I don't think we can simply give people of faith just an automatic pass to discriminate because they make a claim that is contrary to their faith. There's got to be a balance there somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure what that is. And the church hasn't told us what that is. And I'm not sure the legislative opportunities we have right now do that well. What I am convinced of is that some of these conscious protections right now really are essential for the sake of the church and her institutions. You know, because while you may say that, you know, as a pastor, that's a little bit of a different situation for me or a different scenario for me, but that's not necessarily a different scenario for the Catholic school system. You know, that's a big deal. And the truth is, like at the Catholic school system, in order for them, they could end up, in order to address that situation in a way that doesn't violate their own conscience, they could end up having to fire all their non-Catholic teachers and saying we can only hire Catholics, practicing Catholics to do this. Well, that's a real injustice too. You know, that's a terrible idea. And I would hate to see the church put in a position to have to do that. You know, I would hate for Jim Kinnaman, his office, to have to say we can no longer do adoption services. You know, those sorts of things.
I understand that.
So they are real threats. So these pieces of legislation, I don't know if they're the right answer. You know, prudential people can potentially disagree about that. But I do know they're real questions. We can't just dismiss them out of hand as saying that non-discrimination is a value of such importance that it necessarily trumps certain other values.
That's okay.
I think
Interesting point.
I think we'll have a lot of chance to see this issue come up in the next few years, in the national and statewide, and a lot of opportunity to study it, to see things that are happening around the country, and I know that they will continue, both sides will continue to bring forth legislation and make amendments and try to get in religious protections. So just be vigilant about it, because a lot's going to happen in the next few years. I think we do need to address just a few things in regard to poverty issues. One issue that did not make it on our November ballot, it was supposed to be an initiated measure this year, was to put a cap on interest rates for payday loans, title loans, and signature loans. And I know it was a bishop that referred to this, or no, it was one of the vendors that referred to this, that at present, the law allows 400% or higher with no cap. This law, or this measure, was to cap the interest at 36%, which still sounds horrible, but it's a good improvement. This is an issue nationwide, In fact, one of the departments of the National Bishops just had a webinar on it earlier this month. And they are saying these kind of rates prey on the financial hardship of the poor and the vulnerable consumers. They exploit their lack of understanding, which was testified to, and increases economic security for them and their family. So I think this will come up as either a bill or another initiating measure for next year, because it really is an injustice that's going on. Another thing is expansion of Medicaid. South Dakota was one of the 20 states that did not expand Medicaid coverage under the Affordable Care Act. There were several efforts in 2013 and 2014 to expand it through the legislature, but they were not successful. Even an effort by the governor to get federal approval to do a partial Medicaid plan, which would cover about half of the people that would have been covered under the federal plan, was denied in March of this year. So this lack of Medicaid coverage for people who really are in need, or, it's been an issue. And it's even an issue in the governor's race and the debates that you watch. So I would expect that there will be some bills coming forward to try and expand Medicaid coverage. And, you can watch those and see what kind of things that bill is addressing, and whether it's something you support or not. But, there's a lot that we can do through law to try and help the poor and the vulnerable. And one of the measures on our ballot this November is the raising the minimum wage. It's initiated Measure 18, and it would raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $8.50 an hour, and allow for annual cost of living increases each year. This again is a national issue. 13 states have enacted wage increases just this year, ranging from $8.25 to $11 an hour. So, depending on what happens with initiated Measure 18, if it passes, we probably won't have much in the legislature, but if it doesn't pass, I think we'll be seeing some efforts again to raise the minimum wage, because for years they've been trying to do it, and they finally got a raise in 2007, which is what we're living with now, the minimum wage of $7.25, but they did that over a 3-year period. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see in 2 weeks, if that passed or not. Another issue that's been kind of on the radar, both nationally and in South Dakota, is sex trafficking. And this has been a growing concern, and it's one that Representative Noem has taken on quite vigilantly, and the U.S. House has passed 12 bills dealing with sex trafficking. And this past Monday, the Attorney General of South Dakota did join with Attorney Generals from a number of other states in a letter urging the Senate to pass at least 3 of these bills so that they could better strengthen federal law and protect victims. So there's a lot happening there. On the South Dakota level, we did pass a bill in 2011 to define human trafficking and to set some penalties for it. And then in 2013, the South Dakota U.S. Attorney's Office formed a human trafficking task force. So things are coming out of those efforts and are impacting legislation. We're seeing some improvement in South Dakota. It's very likely, though, that we will see some bills introduced for better training for law enforcement officers, possibly safe harbor care for the young people that are rescued, and that includes specialized services, long-term housing, mental health care, educational support, and job training. So this is certainly an issue that affects human dignity, and it's been hidden for years, but it's coming into the light now, and we're seeing better public awareness about this. There's a lot of other issues we could talk about that we just can't cover everything. So if you have specific questions, maybe that's fine. We'll talk about some of them. Just in closing, though, You know, our legislators deal with a lot of issues, and they do a lot to help protect human dignity. Our call is to be both faithful Catholics and faithful American citizens. And Pope Francis has said, a good Catholic meddles in politics, offering the best of himself so that those who govern can govern. And that's our responsibility, is to help our legislators know the truth and to know how we feel about issues. I've given you some examples here on things that you can do. It's not exclusive or, exhaustive list. It's just a start. If you want to throw out something you know about that can be done, we certainly would appreciate that. And I'll leave you with one other regarding prayer. 1 Timothy 2:1. I urge them, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. So the ball's in our court. I did give you another handout too that refers to the CAN legislative website, which is on the Diocese of Sioux Falls. And they do have a lobbyist that is in here session. And you can sign up for alerts on the bills. You can go on their website and see the kind of bills that they're either supporting, opposing, or monitoring. You can find links to the bill itself, to the committee and floor action on the bill, to your representative or senator's vote on the particular bill, and also Catholic teaching on that issue. So it's a resource that I use a lot. There's some tips for communicating with your legislators, and hopefully, on the local level, we can do it a little bit easier and hopefully maybe have a little more impact than on the federal level. And then a prayer before the elections. So I would urge you to say that for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I think just one final comment for me is simply to remember, I think this is especially important in the political climate in which we currently live, where we are so deeply polarized. Remember that the Church's social tradition is born out of love. It is not born out of anger. It is not born out of hate. And the anger and the hate that is so palpable sometimes between the opposing parties, that anger, that hate is not helping us. We are not achieving the ends of Christ in this church with that anger and that hate. The Christian response is always a response of love. And if we can be the loving people that our dignity calls us to be, we're going to go a great deal further in accomplishing the ends of the church than today we're talking against. So, love one another. Let us love one another. Any last minute thoughts or concerns? We have about 5 minutes.
I do have some examples of some materials over here, things that are on the USCCB website or other sources of information, just for your own interest if you want to look at those.
I've just got one question.
Sure.
Because I write my senators and Congress more often this past year. And I get disappointed. I get these formularies back. And pretty much it's a form letter. Oh yeah, well this is my view. It's as if, and I remember once I asked a specific question, but I got the same thing. The person didn't answer the specific question. So, but what do I do? Do I say, oh, you did not, do I write back and say you did not answer my question, or?
Letters anymore are very delayed in getting to the National Congress, so certainly email is probably a preferred communication tool.
It's faster.
But also call the local office, the Sioux Falls office or whatever, Rapid City, whatever you're closer to, and talk to somebody there and tell them that that you want this passed on to your
Right.
senator.
I think I did that once. I did.
And that would be my recommendation as well. Each one of our representatives has an office here in Rapid City, and they have probably offices in Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, and some of the larger communities, as well as their staff on site in DC. And I know that, just because I happen to know the guys that works there, Senator Thune's office has about 4 people on staff, each of whom are assigned to different areas of, and so usually, while you may not get a response from the senator himself, one of the staffers is there to speak on his behalf. Also, it can just be kind of cathartic to call them, let them have it every so often. So.
Anyway, just to stop in at the office and talk. I know that, I know where Senator Thune's office.
Let me just share with you one thing that's called the multiplier effect. And this is in regard to contacting legislators. One phone call to them is equal to 10 other people holding that same view. One letter or email, another 20 people holding that view. One visit to their home office, another 50 people holding that view. Or a visit to the offices at the state capitol or the national capitol, the offices in Washington, D.C. Another 100 people. So, you can do a lot with one little action and maybe, hopefully, get the message across. But the other thing I would say is, no matter how they're responding, you are being faithful to your call as a Catholic and as an American citizen by contacting them and communicating with them. And that's what we're called to do. So, continue to do that, even if you feel it's not making any waves,
And election years like this are actually really helpful years to be able to have a little influence on them because we can show up at Crackle Barrels and those sorts of things where they're there in person, public forums, and we can make them answer a question.
Put them on the spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can put them on the spot.
Yeah, they won't answer. You're right. You can put them on the spot, though. But you can press the issue a little bit there in a public way. So. That's one of the nice things about being from a state as small as ours. I mean, Rick Weiland, that's been part of this whole, as he debates, has been talking about having been to every South Dakota city twice, and
It makes a difference, though. Personal contact makes a difference. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I would say would be personal stories. If you have a story that relates to the issue you're talking about, if you can share that with them, I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up in your full debate or in a story somewhere on their website or something like that. Or if you have a particular issue and have some expertise in that, think about testifying in peer at the bill hearing. They're always looking for people to testify. So get in contact with your senator or representative or somebody on that committee and tell them that you want to speak to that because you deal with this particular issue.
It's not easy on legislators. I know one of the women who promoted that abortion. She's a legislator in North Dakota. She was treated so badly. She was treated with such disrespect, and she was a very intelligent woman, and like you, very knowledgeable, and a lovely woman, faithful to the Catholic Church. But the treatment that she got from the legislators that she serves with, it's a rough road to not be part of what they consider popular. But she stood up and she did it anyway.
Bless her.
That's a good way to end. Let's move back out to the large meeting space.